Hi everyone, it's Michelle from MEW Designs with a video about making my Jerrie bucket bag. So I am up to the last few stages of cutting out. I've cut out all my external pieces out of this really beautiful vinyl. I've cut my lining. I'm using a waterproof canvas, which means that I haven't had to interface it. And I am up to cutting the piece of plastic that goes under the lid to stop the handle from sagging. I have found some chopping board. This is from Kmart in Australia. It's wonderful and soft, but still thick and strong. So this is what I've loved using. But you can use just about any product. Just try and keep it as easy to cut as possible. And you want it to be quite firm so that when you do have a load on that handle, it's stopping the bag from sagging too much. For this particular chopping board, I found that I can score the top and then it almost cracks. So it is a little bit different to, say, if you're using a proper template plastic. So as always, if you are using a sharp blade like this, slow, steady, make sure the blade's sharp. Try not to cut towards you, sort of cut on the edge, and you can actually use masking tape and tape that pattern piece down if you're finding that it moves. I also like to use the edge if I possibly can, so this actually will save me cutting one whole line. And it is just a matter then of very carefully cutting along. Cutting across, move the piece around, line it up again. As you can see, once I've scored it, it actually is really easy then to get the piece out. I like to come in a little bit later and actually punch the holes through once I've a few steps along. So I'm going to put that to one side for now. And I'm going to jump ahead to the top connectors. Now, because I'm using a vinyl here, I'm going to use the raw edges, but I'll explain very quickly how to do it if you're doing the hidden connectors. So this piece of plastic sits under the top piece like that. So it's outside the seams. And the idea is that you connect the handle to it and it's just going to stop that sort of too much sagging inwards. When it comes to the fabric connectors, you will need to just pop the pattern piece over the top to get it. Whereas with the raw edges, it's just a matter of cutting those lines. So with the raw edges, I find it's easier to mark on the inside. Place my piece down. And I've cut holes on each of the markings so I can draw it through to the other side. And I like to check. You may need to have it just slightly wider than an inch. So on here I can see my connectors are fairly spot on for an inch, so I'm just going to just slightly go past that, because that will make sure that there's plenty of room. And then it's just a matter of cutting that line. I try and do it all in one cut using a sharp blade if possible. Start at one corner, punch it through, and just carefully slide down. If you're not comfortable or confident in using the knife, you can also use a ruler and just put the blade next to the ruler just to give you that confidence that you're cutting a nice straight line. And then I always like to turn it over and check that it looks nice on the other side. What you can do that looks lovely here is put some edge coat on. Even just the base coat will be great. It will stop, in this it's got a little bit of a fuzz, so if you're at all worried about that, pop a layer of base coat down and that will tidy that edge up. So the idea here is that you want to be able to snugly put those connectors through. So even though it's a raw edge, it looks really nice and you're not going to see a big chunky raw edge. So that is prepping the top. The next step is the handle and the connectors. Now I will be sewing most of this on my Juki machine, but for the top stitching, I'll be using my industrial because I just love the look of this thread. The first step is, well, if you're not doing the crossbody strap, is the top handle connector. So on this, because it's a vinyl, I'm not going to fold anything. What I am going to do is do a really faint line halfway. Don't have to be super exact. And then I'm going to use some double-sided tape. Now, very important step that I'm very good at missing. Make sure you thread your rectangle rings onto your handle before you sew the loop. I have done it so many times. So just make sure that they're on. So thread them. Then you're going to take the two right sides, pop them together. Clip them. And then we're going to sew at the 1 centimetre seam allowance. When sewing with leather or a leather-like product, like I am today, you need to make sure that you've got your machine set up right. So you need to use a Teflon foot, a walking foot, or a roller foot. I personally prefer using a Teflon foot. I found the walking foot on this machine sounds just terrible when it sews. So I've got my Teflon foot on. You do want to increase your stitch length. On this machine, I like to have it around a 3, so that gives just a little bit longer. If your stitches are too close together, you run the risk of perforating, so it will just tear apart. So take that stitch length up. And for thread, I'm using just a straightforward Resant thread. I find my machine particularly likes it, and I find it does a really good job on bags. It's just a good quality thread. It's got the advantage that it's polyester on the inside wrapped in cotton. I'm going to sew this handle up at that 3/8 1 centimetre seam allowance the whole way along. Make sure you remember to backstitch. And it helps if my needle is threaded. that is my handle sewn. You can top stitch on each side of the seam if you would like. You don't have to do that. And if you're worried about bulk, you can trim this seam down. So now it's a case, I just trim these long threads out of the way. I have a habit of not doing that, and the threads get caught up later, so trim your threads, don't be like me. This is where you can start peeling that double-sided tape. And you've got that line that you can just see through the tape. Bring each side towards it. Now around this seam area, you may need to clip to get it to hold. Can be a little bit tricky there. Just gonna put a big clip in there for now. I find once you've got a few points sitting nicely, the rest will just come together. You can come back and adjust those other bits. And you will need to move the rectangle rings out of the way. I will just pop them there. Again, just with that nice center line. One side sitting nicely, other side. And that is the handle loop ready to sew. Now, because this machine doesn't have a free arm, I would sew it feeding it in like that along that edge. Remembering that you'll have to move these rectangle rings as you sew, and if you have a clip, they're going to hit against there. So now it is a case of sewing, top stitching down each side. So I'm going to jump over to my industrial machine and do the sewing there, and through the magic of technology, come back when that's done. So through the magic of technology, the stitching's now done. Have a check on your D-rings to see if there's a welded joint, because you want to make sure that's on the inside. And then I don't fold, but I sort of find the center and match that through to the other side. So what we're going to do now is stitch the two sides together, so that way you don't see the raw edges. If your machine at this point is just saying, no, too thick, too much, you can just rivet to hold it together. It looks really lovely, and the rivets actually feel kind of nice. But as I'm using the industrial, I won't have any problems. And so far, I haven't found the Juki gives me problems. Because I find getting close to these corners on the rectangle rings a bit tricky, I like to leave an inch, and a really easy way of leaving the same distance on both sides is to use something like masking tape. So it's going to be the same thickness. So masking tape or painter's tape. Always test first and make sure it's not going to damage your leather or vinyl. What I do is sit it underneath. It's got the advantage that it holds the two pieces together too without using clips. So I know the bottom of that tape is my starting and stopping point. I'm going to do the same on the other side. You do have some choices on how you stitch this. So the easiest one is straight down the middle. But if your machine doesn't have the markings to make that just as straightforward as it should be, you can do 2 lines of stitching or even a box of stitching and use the edge of the handle or even the line of stitching as your guide so that it's even on both sides. So it doesn't really matter how you do this joining stitch, so long as if you're doing 2 lines, it's consistent, and if you're going down the center, that you are hitting that center. It can get a little bit thick in this join area, so that's where it's really good to use a hump jumper. So I've got 2 different types here. I prefer to use this type, and I also find when I get to that thick part that if I hand wheel, I can feel what's going on and just make sure that it is sewing nicely and that I'm not getting stitches bunched up or too far apart. So again, I'm going to nick over to the industrial machine, pop that row of stitching in, and come back. I've put 2 rows of stitching down each side, so that's going to hold everything together. You can take the tape off. So even though there is a gap at the end, you're not going to notice those raw edges. And you can also just pop a rivet in. So that is the top handle piece done. So the next are the connectors that will connect this handle into the top. So it's a very similar process of you want to fold those 2 edges in and sew down the side and end up with a connector like this. So again, on this one, for me, the easiest thing to do is draw that line down the middle. Pop the tape down, fold each edge in towards that line. With fabric, you can iron to hold it nice and crisp. It's a little bit harder with something that you can't iron. And then sew down the sides, keeping it consistent with what you've used on the handle. You will have raw ends, which is fine because they get fed inside the top. So all you see is this loop on top. So sew down those 2 edges and those pieces are done and ready to go. The next step is to start assembling the top, the lid. So take one of the gusset pieces and make sure that you've notched. So notches are tiny little nicks that act as a marker. If you're not comfortable doing that, mark it with a pen, pencil or something on the back so that you've got those reference points, because that's going to help match up on the circle. So first step is to take the gusset piece, right sides together, and clip or pin, and we're going to sew across that short edge at the 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. Move my sewing machine in. So that is sewn. You could put top stitching on each side of this seam. That can look like a lovely detail. But on this one, I'm not going to. You can trim the seam back. And another trick that you can do that can help with bulk is to trim these corners, just the ears on the diagonal. You don't want to nick your stitch line. You want to come in nice and close. So that can really help reduce some bulk. So you've got your notches, and they're going to match up to notches on the top. Now, I like to make sure that this seam at the back is, so that's where the handle goes. I like to have the seam at the back essentially, so the front of the bag won't have any seams in it. If your vinyl that you're using is too short to cut these gusset pieces out, and you've put two pieces together, then I would actually recommend having the two joins on the sides of the handle here, so you still get that nice smooth look at the front of the bag. It's just a visual thing. It's not hugely important, but it's one that I definitely like to make sure that I'm sort of aware of and doing. So it's then just a matter of matching the notches up with the notches that you've put in, and then working around, and you will need to ease this piece. So what does that mean? The length of this piece matches the dotted line. It doesn't actually match this cut edge. So you will have a little bit of extra in this seam allowance area when the two sort of dotted lines meet. So don't be too worried if it's not perfect and there's a little bit of gathering. That's because we're aiming to match that stitch line, not the actual cut edge itself. So I've darkened my notches a little bit to hopefully make it a bit easier to see. So we're going to take right sides together. I'll start by clipping just at each notch. So this is where the little cuts come in handy because you can easily see it on both sides. So first run round at all those notches. You can see it almost looks like it won't fit, but I guarantee it will. So once I've clipped at all the notches, then what I like to do is smooth it out a bit, and about halfway between, put my next clip and do that on all the pieces. And then depending on how the material's behaving will be whether I decide to put more clips in. I tend to start and stop stitching close to the seam, the join of the gusset, so I do like to put a few more clips around there because I find starting and stopping is often where it's a little bit tricky. I'm liking how this is sitting, so I'm going to go ahead and sew that. So again, 3/8, 1 centimetre seam allowance. And for sewing something like this, I like to sort of say slow and steady and do it in segments. It's not a race. You don't need to get around the racetrack all in one go. Do a few stitches, stop with your needle down, adjust if you need to, and just take your time. And just keep an eye on those two cut edges and make sure that they're sticking together and that the bottom's not sort of sneaking back underneath. So make sure you backstitch. So as you can see, it is a little bit puckered to ease it in, but it's stitched nicely. And what I do like to do to stop the grinning of the stitches, or when it's under load, the stitches showing through, is put a second row of stitching. And on this, I'm actually going to go from the other side. So it's getting the sort of best of both sides. So this one you can go a little bit faster because nothing's going to move. You're just adding that row in. So I will pop that in now. And you want to be quite close to that edge. So TAFE teachers used to say a pin width. It's probably a little bit more than that. So as close as you can, but you still want to just leave a little bit of room. So that is my second row of stitching. Now, I am going to top stitch as well, but this is definitely an optional step. You don't need to top stitch as it will just sit nicely all the way around. And if you are finding at this back seam that it's not sitting so well, just trim some more back and that will help it sit. If you are top stitching, it can get quite thick. So if you trim a bit in here, that can sort of just help with the bulk when it comes to top stitching. So I will top stitch that and come back and we can move on to the next step. So now the top is ready for those connectors to go in. So remember that I hadn't put any of the markings on my plastic template bit? This is why. I like to look at how thick my pieces are, as well as how accurate I've been on those seam allowances. So I can put the plastic in and make sure it's going to sit in nicely. If I need to, I can actually trim just a little bit off those ends now. And I can also look at when I put my extra line of stitching, will the hole be in the right spot, or do I need to move it out a little bit further? So I like to just check once I'm happy that, yep, that's going to be good. I can then pop the markings in. So I use an awl and mark the center of the rivet hole. So I've marked it a bit. I then carefully push the whole way through. So that will be for the rivets. And then again, just carefully cut out a gap, both ends. So this is where the tail essentially of those strap connectors will pop through. And then looking at these, I will need quite a generous gap because the vinyl is a little bit thicker. So I just want to, when I'm cutting these boxes out, make sure that there's enough room. Don't really want it dragging. And this can be a little bit tricky with this particular plastic. This is the downside to it. So it does things like that. Actually pulls the blade out, so. I'm actually looking at getting an oblong punch that's 1 inch wide so I can just hammer through material like this. So I'll cut those holes out, but I won't do it on camera because it will take a little bit of time. Now it's a matter of attaching the handles. So making sure again that the joins of the rectangle rings are nicely hidden inside. And put the connector through and then squeeze that through. I like to have the connectors really snug in because I think it looks good. And then we will stitch and then rivet to hold them in place. Now, again, if you're finding bits and pieces are moving, masking tape can be great. You can just tape across. So for this step, we're just sewing through the connector and the top fabric, not sewing through anything else. Again, it's nice and snug and make sure it looks nice and even amounts on both sides. Doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be close. And then this can be some tricky sewing because it does get quite thick, but just slow and steady. You're going to sew close to that cut edge across, grabbing all the layers If your machine absolutely won't do it, you can just rely on that rivet, but you need to be pretty sure that that rivet is going to be set perfectly. So I'm going to take this over to my other machine to keep the stitching colour consistent and come back when that's done. So I've sewn just along the edge of both the connectors, so they are now attached. Can grab my stiffening template, pop it in just to make sure that it's going to work. And see, it will fit nicely, and when I smooth it down, it's not popping up or looking odd. So the next step is popping those rivets in as an extra line of defense, just to make sure that that is not moving anywhere. Really happy with that. So I'm going to use a gel marker to mark where I'd like the rivets. You can, of course, use the pattern piece and get the alignment as per the pattern, but for this, I'm going to do it visually, and it can be good to get the rivets that you're actually going to use to see how they'll look and make sure that they're not too close to that stitch line. And the way you can do that is to get the cap of the rivet and pop it where you're sort of thinking it might go. And I think that's going to look excellent about there. So I'm going to go about that 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. I can use my ruler to make sure it's centered. Mark where it's going to go. Do the same on the other side. So again, that 3/8 about 1 centimetre. Pop it halfway. And just make sure that I'm happy with it there. I'm going to use a rivet press to punch these holes. You can do it by hand with a punch and a hammer. If you're using a punch, try and get one that's the same thickness as the shank of your rivet. I will get my press set up. So rivets, I have a punch in my rivet press. I'm going to start on this end. I'm going to grab everything and make sure that it's sitting how I want it to. Feed it under. Pop my hole through. Check that it's made it all the way through. And then on the other side, again, just grabbing all the layers, feeding it under. And it's gone all the way through. So I'm going to pop the punch dies out and put the rivet dies in. I've got 2 sizes of rivets. There are quite a few layers, so I think it's far more likely to be the medium than the small. So if you're not sure, if you feed through, I'm not even seeing the shank of the small size come through, so I know that that rivet is definitely not the right size. So I'm going to go the medium size, feed that through, and I can just see the shank popping through, so that is the perfect size. Pop the cap on that, and that's ready to go. So it's the same for the other side. The rivet through the plastic, through the other side, and again, just a little bit popping out. Get that cap on the other side. And I'm really happy with how they're sitting. So now I will press those rivets in. I like to move it around until I get it locked in and sitting there. Again, a trick I found is if you tap the cap at the back, if it rattles, it's loose and you need to redo it. That one's in nicely. Repeat on the other side. Make sure it's sitting in there. Crimp it. And check that. And that is the top done. Ready to go and ready to move on to the next step. And you can see if you have a bit of weight that plastic is just going to help it from moving. Now that the top's done, the next part is doing the body. This won't have the cutouts, it's just the straight body. And one thing to consider with some of these prints is actually laying out the pieces so that you don't end up, say, with two pieces that are quite similar next to each other. I put them like that. That should look good. So again, 3/8, 1 centimetre seam allowance, and you're going to sew along each panel. Put some clips on. And I will start sewing these. Before you do the final seam, if you're putting top stitching in, this can be a great point to do it because it's giving you flat surfaces to work on. And if you are worried about bulk, this is where you can start trimming some bulk out of those seams. So if you trim it quite close at each end, you can still top stitch it flat, but it means at the top and the bottom of the seam, you're going to have a whole lot less bulk. And that should really, if you're using number 3, sort of a longer stitch length, you should be able to stitch just one side of the seam, pop your needle right in the middle of the seam, and then on the other side, and hopefully avoid too much of the bulk at all. So I'm going to trim all of these down, and then I am going to take this over to the industrial machine to do the top stitching to keep it nice and consistent across the whole bag. And then I'll show my tricks for sewing up the body. So all the panels have been sewn together and top stitched, aside from the last two that we now need to sew these two pieces. So sewing them together is quite straightforward. We'll clip that in place. And again, I'm going to trim and get some bulk out. Now, I don't have a free arm on my sewing machine, so when it comes to top stitching, if I was using this machine, open it out and you can sew all the way along, just making sure that you hold this piece out of the way. What you can do is when you get to the end, backstitch, take it back up and sew down the other side. Or what I do sometimes with a bit of manoeuvring is with the needle down, turn it around and come back the other side. So there's plenty of room to manoeuvre. You just need to make sure that you're keeping an eye on where the rest of it is and making sure it's not accidentally getting caught up underneath. Now, of course, I've been using the industrial for the top stitching, so I'm going to sew those in and then we'll continue with the next step. So now that the outside is all assembled, the next step is putting the gusset around the top. So taking that long piece again, make sure you've notched one side because it makes matching it up easy. Again, I'm going to put the two short edges together, sew across at that 1 centimetre or 3/8 seam allowance. You can decide here if you want to continue with the top stitching. So whatever you've done at the top, it's worth repeating it at the bottom because we will line those two pieces up on either side of the zipper. So I have it on the top, I won't on the bottom. And again, I'm going to trim some of that bulk out. This will help, especially doing the final top stitching around. And this is where those notches really, really help you out. So I've got a notch there. So get the right sides together. I'll start with the notches. Move along, find each notch. Place the notch right where the seam is. This can be where it gets a little difficult if your seam allowances haven't been accurate. Try and ease it in as much as possible to stop bulk being in any one particular spot. And as you know, both these pieces were cut from the same pattern piece, so they're the same size, so they will fit together, even though sometimes when you're putting it together, you mightn't feel like it. So I've clipped at each of the seams, and now add as many clips as you need to feel comfortable in sewing around. Now I'm going to throw clips on the floor. All right, what I'm actually going to do is pop another one in the middle of each panel. And for me, that's enough for me to be comfortable. Feel like it's nice and secure, nothing's going to move. I like starting at what will become the back. It's just a habit. You could start anywhere on the loop. And again, I don't have a free arm on my machine. So if you have a free arm, cylinder arm, you can pop your piece in this way. But what I'm going to do is pop it this way. So I will sew here with the rest of the piece above. As per usual, just keep an eye of where everything is and make sure nothing's getting caught under your machine. And if your seams are thick, grab that hump jumper and just take your time as you go up and over those seams. Again, 1 centimetre, 3/8 seam allowance. So I'm going to start about 1 centimetre or 3/8 away from where that joint is. Nicely lined up. First stitch, make sure you back stitch. And then it's just a matter of sewing the whole way around. Of course, I've now realised it's been a little while since I started this video and I've not put my Teflon foot on. So if that ever happens to you, backstitch, swap the foot, or if you're really stuck, you can pull and guide it through. So that's what I'm going to do. But you should check first. And this is where you can see why trimming back those seams makes this a lot easier. And if you trim back a lot, it means that when you do go to top stitch, there's a lot less bulk that you're trying to jump over, particularly at this back seam where you've got a lot of layers. So top stitching is the optional next step. Turn it around and check it. You can put a second line of stitching around just to secure things. Now that that top gusset's in, the last final step is popping that base in. And it's fairly similar to popping the round in on the top. Make sure you've got those notches. They will line up to the seams. And as always, I will clip the notches in first. And just remember that the bit that needs to match is where you're stitching. It's not those cut edges, so you will have a little bit of extra, the ease, but so long as where you're actually sewing matches, the circle will sit nicely. Go around those corners. And then again, I'm going to put a clip in the middle just to help hold everything in place. You can see it's just a little bit wavy, but that is again because it's not these cut edges that matter, it's where we're stitching that has to match. So again, out of habit, I'm going to start at what I consider the back of the bag where that seam is. And by trimming out that bulk, it's going to make this a lot easier to sew. But if it is a little bit thick, just use your hump jumper on each side, go slowly around. And as you're sewing with the needle down, what I like to do is check and make sure that the bottom layer isn't swinging out of the way. That's the base sewing in. Do like to double check and just make sure that it's sitting nicely. And I'm going to put a second line of stitching and I'll sew from the other side. And that is the base in. You can put a line of top stitching around that base if you want to. It's entirely optional. But this is the exciting part where you can kind of start seeing it all come together. Now that the outside is mostly completed, it's time to move to the inside and doing the lining. It's really similar to the outside, but remember to leave a turning gap. So the turning gap will be in the body pieces, and I like to sew that first so that I know that I have left a turning gap. So same again. So with the turning gap, you want to leave enough room that you will be able to sort of maneuver with your hands, but you don't want to be too close to the top, especially because that's where the zip is going in. So I'm going to sew down a little bit on each side. And again, making sure that you're using that 1 centimetre or 3/8 seam allowance. And that's going to be enough to work with. If you use sewing tags, there's one where I like to do it just near the turning gap. So again, that I remember to do it. And now it's just a case of assembling all the panels together in the loop exactly as you did for the outside. Something to keep an eye out with waterproof canvas is making sure that you have the right sides together. I can see on this one I don't, so a little bit of unpicking. Again. And that looks better. On this last seam, I always double check that I do have that turning gap. So again, make sure you've notched that base, which I haven't. I'm going to quickly do it now. It certainly makes it a lot easier putting it in. If you are using a cotton, it can pay to iron those seams down, but I don't trust myself with the iron and waterproof canvas. Again, I'm going to make sure that I've got the right side. And again, I'm going to put the clip just in the middle to help. And let's sew that base in. And that is the base all sewn in. The last step is the gusset for the top. Right sides together, and again, sewing on that short edge at the 3/8 or 1 centimetre seam allowance. And that is the lining prepped. The next step is the zipper. And I know that this is a step that is sort of a little bit scary, so I will go through, give as many tips as I can. I am going to be using the technique that you'd used for fabric, where the ends will be folded under, but you can have raw edges. So I have my zipper tape, and first thing will be to cut 70 centimetres of it. When cutting zipper tape, I recommend not using your good scissors because you will find that you'll end up with a blunt spot in the middle of your scissors. So now trim the end nice and straight. And measure out. centimetres. What I'll do is just a little nick to get me started. And put the tape measure down. That is my 70 centimetres. Make sure you pop the zip pull on. There is nothing worse than realising that there's no pull on. You can use 2 zip pulls, which can be super fun because then you can have the zipper placed, the 2 zipper pulls placed at the front of the bag. This one I'm just doing 1. And whenever you cut zipper tape, make sure you seal it. So you can use a fabric glue, or I'm going to use just a lighter and just go across the end, and then I pull at it to make sure that I've sealed. You'll want to do the other end as well. Again, let it cool, pull at it. So both those ends of that zipper tape are nice and sealed, so I know it's not going to fray. It's my zipper done. So usually with the fabric, you can iron down the fold. On this one, I've creased it as much as I can, so I'll be able to find it again. And what we're going to do is make a zipper sandwich. Now, at this point, you can trim the zipper tabs down to match the zipper tape size. There are different widths in zipper tape. And I will do that on this. So I'm just going to take, looks like it's about 1/4 inch, 7 millimetres off. It doesn't have to be exact. Okay. So that's a bit closer. So you want right side of zipper tape, zipper tab rather, so that's your zipper tab. I'm going to put the zipper tape facing up, and then the other tab facing down. Make a little sandwich there. Clip it in place, and then we're sewing across at that 1 centimetre 3/8 seam allowance. You may need to use a hump jumper to help your foot get up onto the zipper teeth and down on the other side. And whenever you are sewing over zipper teeth, it's always best to hand wheel and go slowly and just make sure that your machine is making the stitches and that it's not struggling too much through that extra thick part. For hump jumpers, this is my favourite one. What I'm going to do is start at the edge. I'm going to back stitch. And do a couple of stitches, and so I can see the front of my foot now is lifting up as it's hitting those zipper teeth. So I'm going to get my hump jumper, I'm going to lift the foot, put the hump jumper underneath the foot, pushing right up against the zipper teeth. and that keeps my foot nice and level. And keep sewing, just about to hit those teeth. And slowly, and I can see now that my foot's going to do the opposite, that the back is going to be lifted up by the zipper teeth. Do one more. I'm going to take the hump jumper, do the same thing. I'm going to lift the foot, slide it under, so the hump jumper is sitting against the teeth, and in the groove, you can keep sewing until I get to the other side. I can take it out there, and then I'm going to backstitch just to hold everything in place. And that is one side in. And then you can top stitch along, hold it all in place. In this case, I'm not going to worry about that. So you can see here I've creased the 1 centimetre. If you're using fabric, that would be nicely fused in place. And what we're going to do is pop the zipper, those two ends folded down. Clip it in place. It's where you just make sure that the zipper is even across, and then top stitch on this side. So there'll be 2 lines of top stitching. On this side, it will only be held in place with the top stitching. You do want to make sure that you've got about 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch of zipper tape coming in. So it should be the same amount as you folded under. And that's going to give you the perfect diameter of loop that will fit into the top and bottom. So I will again, when you're top stitching, hand wheel over the zipper teeth and just make sure that those stitches are forming. And if you need the hump jumper, just pop that in. Do the same on the other side. Again, with the zipper teeth nice and slow, and just make sure that all your stitches are forming. And that is the zipper done. So that will be what shows on the inside. And that will be on the outside. And we're ready to start assembling. Make sure that your base outside is inside out so you can see the wrong side facing you. Then you want to make sure that that zipper tab, I like putting it at the back where the seam is on the gusset piece. So you want to have your zipper right side, so the good side, facing the outside. I always like to spend a little bit of time with the zipper tab, just getting it nicely centered so it looks good. And then I like to put just a few clips at this stage in. And see, wherever your zipper pull is, it's going to add a little bit of extra bulk because of the top of the zipper pull. So we will be moving that around to get everything sitting nicely. Pop a few clips in just to sort of get us going and hold everything in place. Then you want the lining. You want the right side facing, so that at the bottom of the bag, the two right sides will be facing together and the zipper will be sandwiched at the top. I like to have my label and the turning gap at the back. And what you can do here is, although these seams don't go all the way up to the top, you can sort of match them. So I'm going to pop the turning gap. I'm going to match it up to this back seam here. And pop that in. And then this is the zipper pull. It's getting in the way of this panel, so I'm just going to move the zipper pull around. Now, if you've used a woven lining, you can iron these seams nice and flat. That makes them a bit easier to work with. And you can sort of use the seam on the inside just to line that up. And know that you sort of have it fitting nicely. I'm going to pop another couple of clips here. And what I'm going to do is move that zipper pull back into this piece because we know that that's all fitting nicely. And then again, using the seam here helps with the placement. And if you've got notches, that also helps. Just going to let that siren go past if you can hear it. It's one so far on this video, so I'm doing well. Again, clip there. This is a point where sometimes it can get a little bit scary because it looks like it doesn't fit. It looks all kinds of wrong. But the reason behind that is those few millimeters of difference in the diameter of the circle. So keep working at it, get it as even as you can, but if there's a little bit of ease, that's actually okay. That is how it works sewing in circles. Okay. Keep sort of finding the center of the panel between the two clips that you've put in. You just want to make sure that it's mostly looking even. Because these seams on the outside don't come all the way up to the top, goes to the gusset, it doesn't matter if they're not perfectly aligned. You've got a little bit of wiggle room there. The other thing I like to do is actually push the layers out. I find you'll actually see them sitting a lot more snugly when you do that because you're sort of stretching it, you're taking the ease out. So you can see as you start doing that, it's sitting a lot flatter. It doesn't look so puckery anymore. So clip as much as you need to feel comfortable sewing it, to know that it's sort of going to hold in place. And don't panic if one side is looking a little bit puckery. It will work out. Don't start cutting things down. It's really important to keep all these circles the same diameter. if you reduce the size of your zipper, it will make the top pull in and it won't sit as well at the end. So trust your sewing, trust your measurements, and just don't panic at this stage. So I'm going to sew that whole zipper in, remembering that you will need to move that zipper pull. So I've got the zipper pull sitting nice and close to the turning gap, so that will make it a little bit easier. I'll probably start about here. So what I'll do is move that zipper forward. I'll start sewing here, sew across a little bit, then I'll lift the foot up, move the zipper pull back, get that out of the way, and then I can sew round the whole thing and not have to worry about it again. This is why it's also important to make sure that you leave a generous enough turning gap that you can get your hand in to move that zipper pull around. And I'm going to sew around. Where you've got the tab at the back, you may need to use your hump jumper just to get the foot to go up. So I've got my hump jumper just in case. Now, I don't have the free arm on the machine, so that's why I'm working with the bag on this side. And I find it works quite well. I'm going to use 1/4 inch seam allowance. There's a little bit of flexibility on the seam allowance that you use on the zipper. The most important thing is use the same on both sides. I'm just coming up to the zipper tab, so I'm going to hand wheel, go slowly, go carefully, make sure that those stitches are forming. My machine is coping with the bulk. It's doing a great job. You may need the hump jumper to come down off the zipper tab. Oh, it's doing fine. Remembering that I've got that lump of the zipper pull, so I'm going to sew a little bit along. So with the needle down, lift the foot up, go back through that turning gap, grab that zipper pull and maneuver it out of the way. If you're finding that the zipper pull is impossible to move out of the way, you can at this point backstitch, actually pull it out, move the zipper, and then come back and carefully put your needle back, starting in the same spot that you did the backstitch, and start again. So all is not lost if you're just struggling to get that zipper pull past. As you're sewing, keep an eye on the zipper tape to make sure that it hasn't snuck in. Sometimes I find that it's a little bit slippery and it likes to kick away. So I do a little bit, stop and check and just make sure everything's still in alignment, and then I can see the 3 layers of the sandwich, that I've got my vinyl underneath, I've got my zipper and the lining as well. So that is the zipper sewn in, and you can see it's gone from, it was quite puckery when I clipped it, to it looks quite even. And I will turn it out. I find the easiest way to turn this one through is to grab those 2 corners, start pulling it in, pull them through. And as with all turning throughs, nice and slowly, a little bit at a time. That is one side of the zipper in. And as you can see, it's sitting really nicely there. I like doing the top stitching on the zipper at the same time, and because it gives a better consistent result, and it also helps here doing that top stitching last when working around this plastic. So that is one half of the zipper in. And we'll move on to the next side. So again, inside out. You'll have the same on this side of that zipper pull being quite thick, and so you will need to manoeuvre it around. And I like to keep it to one end. Now with the top, you've got that back seam, and I like to have those two seams lined up over the tab. So I'll start with that. And clip that in place. This is another point where you might start to think, not the same size, it's not going to work, what's going on? But remember, those two gusset pieces, top and bottom, are exactly the same length, and you've sewn them up with the same seam allowance at the back, so it will fit. Take your time on this. And have faith that it will work, because it will. Pop that zipper pull back in there now that I've put that all off. Again, on this one, I like getting it mostly in. You can see this is where it starts to look like it's not going to fit. What you can do, if it's getting really difficult to work, is actually open that zipper. Then the gusset will also need to be clipped in. Again, I'm going to line up the seams. And again, this can be a little easier sometimes if you push everything flat as you're clipping, because that's how it will actually sit. If you do get it all clipped in and find that you have a little bit extra like that, ease that back in around, because again, the problem is because of the circles. And if you twist everything around, you'll find that then the outside is tight and the inside starts to pucker. Just spend a little bit of time on this, but don't stress that it's not perfect when you're clipping. It will look a whole lot better when it's sewn up. I'm just going to adjust that back in. So I'm at the zipper pull now. This side is where moving the zipper pull can get a little tricky. So again, if it's just stuck and won't move, back stitch, move the zipper pull, come back in and start sewing at the same spot. And just, I tend to put the main body of the bag at the back so I can sew the loop around the top. As you're getting to these edges with the template plastic, it can get just a little bit awkward. And just go nice and slowly, take your time. So again, when it was clipped in, it looked really puckery. Once you've sewn it, it sits really well. So have faith, trust yourself. And that is the zipper installed. Don't top stitch yet. That little bit of extra wiggle room really helps getting the binding in. which is the next step. So the next step now of putting the top in, make sure you've notched. I've just done some unpicking because I didn't notch and so it didn't work. I also want to make sure that the two wrong sides are going together. So these raw edges are going to be hidden underneath the binding. So like I do with a lot of other steps, match those notches up first. Once you've matched the notches, then I like to do what I do on all the other steps and start clipping in between. You can add as many clips as you need just to get that looking nice. I'm going to be using a piece of the waterproof canvas as the binding. The nice thing about the waterproof canvas is it doesn't fray so much. So I didn't have to cut it on the bias. And that will just go round. But first step is to sew these two together, and then this unfinished seam will be hidden by the binding. So you might need to maneuver around some of these corners where the stiffening is. That's why I don't top stitch, because it just gives you a little bit more space. I don't have the free arm on the machine, so I'll be sewing it like this. And the trickiest part is where the two pieces connect. So you might just need to maneuver things to get them in and out of the way. Sew around. As you're sewing, keep an eye and make sure that the two edges are together, because you are sewing a circle to a straight line, it will slip around a little bit. And it can be handy to have something to sort of maneuver. So 1 centimetre, 3/8. Another stitch. Start sewing around. That's the top sewn in. You can trim back this seam if your binding's narrow. So if you've got pre-made binding that you particularly want to use and it's narrower, just trim this seam back. So long as you do that initial stitch line at the 3/8 1 centimetre so that the circle perfectly meets, you can trim this down as much or as little as you need. I'm going to do a quick check, see if I do need to trim mine down. I think it will just about be right. Might just give it the tiniest little haircut. Happy with that. I like doing the binding in 2 steps, so I'm going to sew it to the outside first and then do a second row of stitching on the inside. And the reason that I start with the outside is when you do the second stitching on the inside, you might overrun a little bit, but you don't really see the outside. And Because this isn't cut on the bias, I'm going to do a straight seam at the end. And a handy trick is you can use your gusset pattern piece because that's going to be the same diameter. If you're using a woven cotton that's actually on the bias, when you're sewing it in, tug it ever so slightly. It helps it almost suck in and sit a little bit nicer. I won't be doing that because it's no bias. And I'm going to put that in, pop it around. Pop a few clips in just to hold everything in place. I'm going to do using a contrasting bias can make this a little bit easier because then it's not just all layers of the same colour. I'm going to sew from the inside again. It just is a little bit easier with my machine. And again, as you're sewing, just make sure that that bottom layer isn't slipping anywhere. You know these top few layers are all held together nicely. The next step, if you're using pre-made bias, it will already have the nice fold in it. I have to fold myself. Start doing that all around the edges. The aim when sewing this side down is you want to hide the stitches from sewing the first row of bias and also sewing the two pieces together. Lots of clips. Make sure you're happy with how it's sitting and how it's looking. That's all ready to go. So when I stitch on this side, you will see a line of stitching on the other side, but it tucks in nicely on the final. And again, around these corners, sometimes it can get a little bit tight. So just do a little bit at a time, maneuver as you need to, remembering needle down as you adjust things. And because I find this back area the more difficult, I like to start there so the tricky part's out of the way. Once I'm through that, I know the rest will be a piece of cake. So as I'm sewing, I'm trying to sew right on the edge. I'm checking to make sure that that stitching is hidden underneath. And I do like to smooth the back a little bit as I go too. Just work that little bit that you're about to sew, get it sitting nicely, sew, then move on to the next piece. That is the bias sewn in. So as you can see at the back, sometimes it does run off, but as soon as we tuck that up, sitting in the top, you won't notice it at all. It's just that nice outside line. And that is the bias in the top done. So there is, of course, the turning gap and then the top stitching to go. So the turning gap, you can absolutely do it by hand in a nice lattice stitch and pull that together, or you can sew it on the machine. If you're sewing it on the machine, I like to make sure when I've got those two edges together that the bottom edge is just peeping out so that I can see it, and I make sure that that bottom layer isn't slipping underneath. Now, my top thread here is quite a good colour match. My bottom's not too bad, so I think for this one, I will machine stitch it. What I like to do is put a pin in where the stitching sort of stops, so I know exactly where I need to start and stop. Fold these in, put a couple of clips on. You can see I actually have missed a little bit of the turning gap up the top there. Might hand sew that. The last step is top stitching around that zipper, which I will be doing on the industrial machine so that it looks consistent with the other top stitching. And again, if you've got a free arm, do it on there. But if you're like me, don't, turn everything inside out for that top stitching. And it means that you can get it under the foot. Around here will be a little bit tricky. And again, I'd move the zipper a little bit, sew across, and then move the zipper back out of the way. I might even film doing this on the industrial just to show that it's absolutely possible, and pop that into the end of the video. But that is all the essential stuff really when it comes to sewing the Jerrie bucket bag. And I hope there's some helpful tips, tricks, and hints in there. If you've got any questions, pop them down in the comments. I will read them, and if I need to update the video, it gives me an opportunity to do that. And of course, if you like the video, please press that thumbs up. If you'd like to subscribe, hit the subscribe button and the notification button. So the notification button will let you know if I upload any videos. And have a blast sewing the Jerrie. I can't wait to see what you create with this pattern.